He lost everything. The pain consumed him. But then, something impossible happened. What if I told you that a man was already rotting, abandoned to his fate, rejected by everyone, condemned to slowly waste away until his last breath? But Jesus did something unbelievable. This is not just another story about Jesus' miracles. This is a story that can change the way you see faith, compassion, and the impossible becoming reality. Now I ask you, how far would you go in search of a miracle? Would you face the pain, the rejection, the humiliation? Would you bear the looks of contempt, the cold words of someone who has already given up on you? Would you still have the strength to believe that one day everything could change? This is a powerful story, one of the miracles of Jesus that few know about. The story of a man who no longer had hope. His body was already rotting while alive, and yet, in the deepest despair, he dared to believe that Jesus could do the impossible. What if I told you he was right? But before I continue, I want you to pay close attention to what will be revealed here. This is not a story, it is not a parable invented to illustrate a teaching. This is real. This happened. This is the miracle of the old man who was already rotting, but Jesus did something unbelievable. The wind blows hard, lifting fine dust from the dry ground. The scorching sun illuminates an arid, lifeless land. Stones scattered across the desert reflect suffocating heat. On the horizon, some mud and stone huts form what remains of a small village far from Jerusalem. And then, in the midst of this desolate landscape, we find Eleazar. He is sitting in a dark corner of a cave. His eyes, deep and dull, observe nothing. His skin, marked by disease, bears open wounds that stink of death. His fragile body, consumed by time and abandonment, can barely support its own weight. He moans softly, his hoarse and tired voice mixing with the sound of the wind. How long has he been there? Days, weeks, maybe months? Time no longer makes sense to someone like Eleazar. Your body no longer belongs to you. The rotting flesh, the wounds that never heal, the twisted fingers that can no longer grasp anything. He is alive, but at the same time, he is already dead to the world. The only thing left inside him is one question. Why? Why did God abandon me? Why am I still alive if I am already nothing? Loneliness is your only company. No friendly voice, no compassionate look. Just the sound of the wind and the distant footsteps of people who avoid looking at the cave where he hides. But Eleazar doesn't know. He doesn't realize that his life is about to change forever. This kind of story does not exist on any other YouTube channel. You are about to meet one of Jesus' most unknown miracles, a powerful story that almost no one has heard. But it can completely change the way you see faith and miracles. And since you like emotional and deep stories, this channel was made for you. Here, each report is a rare treasure. Every detail was researched and told in a unique way, so that you live this experience as if you were there, in the time of Jesus. So to ensure that you don't miss any of these incredible stories, subscribe to the channel Unknown Stories of Jesus and turn on notifications. Like this, whenever a new story is revealed, you will be one of the first to know. And how this video was made especially for you, the like is already separated there, just waiting for your click. After all, if this story reached you today, it's because somehow she needed to be heard. Get ready, because this story is just beginning. The sun burned over Jerusalem. The dry air carried with it the dust of the stone streets, where people walked hurriedly, busy with their daily tasks. The smell of freshly baked bread mingled with the aroma of spices sold at small stalls in the market. Merchants loudly advertised their wares: fresh dates, freshly caught fish from the Sea of Galilee, fine fabrics from Tyre and Sidon. Children ran among the adults, playing and laughing, while the elders negotiated prices, tested the quality of goods, and discussed the news that was spreading quickly throughout the city. But in the midst of all this life and movement, there were those who were not seen, those who were ignored, feared, rejected. And one of those men was Eleazar. Eleazar had already walked these same streets with pride a few years ago. He was a respected merchant, owner of a stall well located in the market, where he sold excellent quality fabrics. He negotiated with the rich and powerful of Jerusalem, clothing them in the finest linens and silks they could afford. His wife, Miriam, always waited for him at home with a smile, and his 2 children ran into his arms when he returned from a day at work. His life was good. He was a prosperous man, admired and surrounded by friends. But everything changed. First, it was a small spot. On his skin, a pale, strange tone that he ignored. Then the numbness in the hands, the difficulty in holding the fabrics. Over time, the wounds began to appear, small at first, but then deeper, painful, slowly consuming his flesh. When the first rumors began to circulate among traders, his customers began to avoid him. Leprosy. It was a cruel sentence, a condemnation without trial. The law of Moses was clear. Command the children of Israel to remove every leper from the camp. So Eleazar, who had previously been received with respect, began to notice looks of contempt and fear. The same people who greeted him in the market now looked away. One day, while he was still trying to work, a group of temple priests surrounded him. One of them, wearing embroidered robes and a breastplate with 12 precious stones representing the tribes of Israel, raised his hand and pointed sternly at Eleazar. "You are unclean. It can no longer remain among us." His voice sounded like a death sentence. All around, people began to murmur. Some quickly moved away, as if their proximity was enough to make them unclean as well. Eleazar tried to argue. He didn't want to leave. That was his home. But there was no mercy on those faces. "Get out of here, Eleazar!" shouted a man. "The law requires you to stay away," said another. It was then that something happened that Eleazar would never forget. His own son, the eldest, the one who held his hand so many times as he crossed the streets of Jerusalem, hid his face and took a step back. Eleazar looked into his wife, Miriam's eyes, looking for some resistance, a sign that she would try to stop what was happening. But he found nothing but sadness and fear. He felt his heart shatter. "Go, don't look at me," Eleazar whispered. He turned and left the city without looking back. Separated from everything he knew, Eleazar walked through the desert until he found shelter in a cave, far from Jerusalem. Alone. No name, no life. Just a body slowly rotting. But what if Jesus was there? What if, in that same market where Eleazar had lost everything, there had been a different voice? The Pharisees were strict about ritual purity, and anyone who had a skin disease was declared unclean. Lepers had to live far from others, in caves or isolated villages, begging for food, covered in rags to hide their wounds. They needed to warn their approach by shouting, "Unclean, unclean," so that no one would be contaminated by touching them. It was as if they were already dead to the world. The priests reinforced that leprosy was a divine punishment for past sins, and therefore many believed that there was no salvation for these people. But Jesus saw beyond. What Eleazar didn't know was that while he lived his days of suffering in the cave, a name began to spread through the streets of Jerusalem: Jesus of Nazareth. Some said that he was a prophet, others that he performed signs and miracles that no one could explain. In the market, some merchants commented, "Have you heard about the Rabbi of Galilee? He cured a blind man in Capernaum, and that paralytic just got up and walked. But could he touch a leper?" The Pharisees laughed at these stories. No teacher, no priest would ever dare touch an unclean man. But some people were beginning to wonder if perhaps Jesus was different. The city didn't know yet, but Eleazar's destiny was about to change. What comes next will surprise you. The wind whistled between the rocks of the cave, bringing with it hot desert dust. Night had already fallen, and the cold now replaced the scorching heat of the day. Eleazar was curled up at the bottom of the rock shelter, shivering, his thin arms hugging his body in search of a warmth he hadn't felt in a long time. His skin, once firm and healthy, was now covered in open wounds, exposed flesh, an acrid smell of rot that not even the wind could dispel. He was breathing hard. Every sigh was an effort. The pain seemed to be ingrained in his bones, a constant presence, a reminder that his body was slowly breaking down. His swollen hands were so deformed that he could barely hold them closed. His feet, once agile when he walked the streets of Jerusalem as a respected merchant, were now just pieces of wounded flesh, unable to support his weight for long. For a moment, Eliezer closed his eyes, trying to forget the reality that consumed him. But all it took was one movement for a twinge of pain to bring him back. His stomach growled, but he no longer felt hungry in the same way. It was more of a distant nuisance, almost like an insignificant detail next to everything else. The worst was the thirst. The throat is dry, the tongue is rough against the roof of the mouth. The last time he had drunk water was 2 days earlier, when he had found a dirty puddle after a quick rain in the desert. Since then, all he had done was lick his parched lips, hoping that the saliva would be enough to fool his body for a few more hours. Eliezer slowly opened his eyes and stared at the dark ceiling of the cave. A sigh escaped, and he muttered with a weak voice, broken by time and pain, "Has God forgotten me?" The sound of his own voice sounded strange. There were days, maybe weeks, when he didn't speak to anyone. Silence was his only company. Eliezer swallowed and closed his eyes once again. The memories came without him calling them. The face of Miriam, his wife, smiling at him as she prepared dinner. The laughter of his children running around the house, playing, calling for him. The soft touch of small hands grasping his tunic as he came home from the market. All of this lost. Everything he had been, what he owned his entire life, everything had been ripped away the moment his skin began to rot. Eliezer felt his eyes burn, but he didn't cry. Maybe because I had already shed all the tears I had. Maybe because his body no longer had the strength to do that. He forced himself to move, trying to find a slightly less painful position. The slightest effort made his wounds throb. A low moan escaped her lips, but there was no one there to hear it. Next to him, a piece of hard bread, already half covered in sand. That's what they threw at him last time. He didn't know who or whether they had done it out of pity or simply to get rid of him faster. He reached out with a trembling hand, picked up the piece of bread, and brought it to his mouth. Chewing was slow and painful. His teeth were weak, his gums hurt, and swallowing was a challenge, but he needed to feed, at least to prolong the inevitable wait for death a little longer. Eliezer looked out of the cave, the dark sky, lit by a handful of stars. He wondered how many more nights he would have to spend there. How many more times would I wake up only to continue dying a little more each day? The thought was a crushing weight. He wanted to sleep. But sleeping meant waking up the next day, and waking up the next day meant another day of pain. Maybe he thought it would be easier if he just didn't wake up anymore, but something inside him still fought. Maybe it was survival instinct, or maybe a spark of hope that refused to die completely. Eliezer wasn't sure what it was, but even in his desperate situation, even though he knew there was no one else who cared about him, something inside him whispered that his story wasn't over yet. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in a long time, said a prayer. If there is still a purpose for me, show me. The only answer was the cold night wind. And yet, for the first time in years, Eliezer felt a small, almost imperceptible glimmer of hope. The wind howled between the rocks, bringing with it the dry smell of the desert and the distant murmur of voices. Eliezer, huddled in the dark corner of the cave, squeezed his eyes shut, trying to ignore the pain that pulsed through every fiber of his body. The cold of the night seeped into his bones, making his limbs stiff, and every movement was like a knife tearing his diseased flesh. How long had it been there? He no longer knew how to count the days. His world was limited to the darkness of the cave, the bitter taste of stale bread, and sleepless nights filled with suffocated moans. But that night something was different. The sound of footsteps on the nearby trail interrupted the silence. There were two men walking slowly, their voices echoing between the stones. Eleazar didn't usually pay attention to travelers. Many passed by and ignored his presence, afraid of approaching an unclean man. But this time, he heard something that made his heart falter. "Did you hear about that man from Galilee?" said one of them, his voice full of curiosity. "They say he heals the sick, even lepers." Lepers. The word hit Eleazar like a blow to the chest. He opened his eyes, his heart beating faster. "It can't be true," replied the other, laughing disdainfully. "No man can touch a leper and come away unharmed. The priests say this is impurity." "But he is not an ordinary man," insisted the first. "They say he opened the eyes of a blind man with a touch, who made a paralyzed man walk with just one word, who multiplied bread and fish to feed an entire crowd." Silence stretched between the two for a moment. "And you believe that?" "I don't know, but I heard from a merchant who saw it with his own eyes." The footsteps continued, and, little by little, the voices were lost in the night. But for Eleazar, those words didn't disappear. They echoed inside him, louder than anything he had ever heard. Jesus of Galilee, a man who healed, a man who touched the unclean without fear. Eleazar felt something inside him, something he hadn't felt in years, a spark, a glimmer of hope. He tried to shake the thought away. It was impossible. Since being expelled from Jerusalem, he had learned that there was no hope for men like him. He was an undead, an exile, a man who should have disappeared by now. But still, that voice inside him insisted. What if it were true? What if this man really could cure him? Eleazar took a deep breath. He couldn't remember the last time he wished for something. For years, he accepted his condition. He convinced himself that this was the end. But now, for the first time, your heart beat differently. He moved slowly, supporting himself with his trembling, injured hands, trying to lift his torso. The pain was unbearable. His body, weak and consumed by illness, seemed to want to trap him there in the darkness of the cave. But something inside him screamed louder than the pain. Eleazar managed to sit up. His legs tingled, numb from being still for so long. He inhaled, exhaled. His chest rose and fell heavily, but there was a new purpose in his breathing. He grabbed a piece of dirty cloth from his side and used it to wipe the sweat from his forehead. His hands were shaking. He looked at them. Peeling skin, flesh open in places, bones appearing in certain places. He was no longer the same man who walked the streets of Jerusalem, who traded fine fabrics, who came home and kissed his wife and children. That man had already died. But what if a new man could be born? That's it. Could Jesus really do this? Eleazar tried to get up. His knees gave out, and he fell onto his side. But he didn't give up. With a groan, he forced himself up again, bracing himself against the cold cave wall. His arms were shaking. Every muscle screamed in protest, and then he did it. Eleazar stood, staggering, breathing hard, holding on to what he could, but standing. He felt a lump in his throat. He didn't know exactly what to do next. But for the first time in years, Eleazar wanted to live. Now I ask you, if you were in Eleazar's place, would you have the courage to go after Jesus? Would you believe that a miracle would still be possible? Comment below. I believe in the impossible. And let's continue this story together. Eleazar felt his heart beating inside his chest as if it suddenly had a reason to beat again. The simple act of standing was already a miracle for someone who had spent so long prostrate, waiting only for death. But now, for the first time in years, he had a goal. He needed to find Jesus. The idea seemed absurd. His body was destroyed, his strength was almost non-existent, and he didn't even know where to find that man. But there was something inside him, something that burned brighter than any doubt. If that man really healed, If Jesus really was able to restore even a leper, then Eleazar had no other choice. He looked around the cave he had called home for so long. The cold, damp walls, the dust-covered floor, the few rags he used as a bed. How many nights had he spent there without hope, just waiting for death to come? He could no longer accept that fate. Eleazar leaned against the stone wall, taking a deep breath. Every muscle in his body protested against that effort. His legs shook, the open. Wounds on his feet throbbed, but he refused to give up. He looked for something around him that could serve as support and found a dry branch, forgotten in a corner of the cave. With difficulty, he grabbed the piece of wood and leaned on it, transforming it into his improvised cane. Then he took another deep breath and took the first step. Pain shot through his leg like fire, but he continued. Then one more, and another. His body screamed for him to stop, but his soul refused to give in. Eleazar walked out of the cave and was immediately hit by the scorching heat of the sun. The sky was clear, without a single cloud to soothe the burning on my skin. The desert stretched out before him, vast and cruel. The wind kicked up fine dust, which clung to the sweat on his face. Every step was a challenge. Every meter covered seemed like an eternity. But Eleazar didn't look back. With each movement, his breathing became more labored. Thirst began to tighten in his throat, and he realized he hadn't thought about it before leaving. He had no water, he had no food, he had nothing. Just your desire to find Jesus. The sun rose higher, and the heat seemed to crush him like an invisible weight. His tunic, dirty and tattered, clung to his sweaty body. He felt the dust covering his skin, accumulating in the cuts and wounds, making everything even more unbearable. But he continued. His feet dragged across the dry earth. Sweat ran down his face, mixed with dust. His eyes burned, but he refused to stop. His body screamed for rest. His muscles were exhausted. His stomach, empty for days, was churning in protest. But none of that mattered. He had a purpose. He needed to get to Jesus. And then, in the distance, Eleazar saw a small village. Simple stone and mud houses stood on the horizon, and a dirt road cut through the village. He felt momentary relief. There he could get some water, maybe a crumb of bread. But as soon as he got closer, he noticed the looks. A boy playing with a rag ball stopped, and his eyes widened when he saw him. The mother, who was sitting in the shadow of the front door, quickly pulled the child away and hid him behind her. Other residents began to notice his presence. Eleazar tried to keep walking, pretending he didn't notice the looks. But then someone shouted, "Leper! He's a leper!" The chaos was immediate. People started to move away. Some ran into the house. Others picked up stones from the ground. Eleazar tried to raise his hands in a gesture of supplication. "I just want water." His voice was hoarse, weak, almost a whisper, but no one listened to him. The first stone grazed his shoulder, tearing a piece of fabric from his tunic. The second hit his knee, causing him to stagger. "Stay away! You can't be here! Unclean!" Eleazar closed his eyes for a moment. The physical pain was strong, but it didn't compare to the humiliation. He was treated like an animal, like a monster. No one cared if he was thirsty, hungry, or suffering. For them, Eleazar was already dead, but he didn't back down. He raised his head and, even with difficulty, continued walking. Stones continued to be thrown. Screams continued to echo around him. But Eleazar didn't stop. "If this Jesus really has power, he will not reject me." The words left his lips without him realizing it, and at that moment something changed inside him. He was no longer just walking. He was struggling. The village was left behind, but their journey was far from over. The sun was beginning to sink below the horizon, and Eleazar knew he needed to continue. He no longer cared about the pain, the thirst, the hunger. He just needed to find Jesus. The sun was already setting when Eleazar reached the top of the hill. His feet were raw, covered in dust and dried blood. His body, weakened by hunger and thirst, trembled with every step. But there, up ahead, he finally saw what he was looking for. A crowd followed the dirt road, a large group of people, some wearing simple cloaks. others more noble clothes, but all with a single objective: be close to Jesus. In the center of that movement, he was. The Rabbi of Nazareth walked with calm steps, surrounded by his disciples. There was something different about him, something Eliezer couldn't explain. Even from afar, I could feel a presence that went beyond what the eyes could see. There was something divine about that man. Eliezer felt his heart race. That was the moment. His body screamed for him to stop. His mind told him. He had no more strength, but his spirit pushed him forward. He grabbed the piece of wood he was using for support and started walking down the hill. Every step was a struggle. Every breath was an effort. But he continued. The ground seemed to spin beneath his feet. His body was too weak, and he stumbled, falling to his knees in the dust. But he didn't get up immediately. He looked ahead and saw that some people had already noticed him. Some pointed, others backed away, whispering among themselves. The disciples had also stopped. The noise from the crowd began to die down when they realized what was happening. Eleazar took a deep breath. The chest rose and fell with difficulty. He knew what would happen next. He knew he would be rejected, that they would throw him out of there like they always did, but he had no other choice. It was all or nothing. With effort, leaning on the improvised cane, Eleazar gathered his last strength and shouted, "Jesus!" The name echoed on the road. Silence took over the crowd. The looks that were once curious turned to horror, a leper in their midst. Eleazar saw the fear on people's faces. Some began to retreat. Women pulled their children away. Men covered their faces with their cloaks. He already knew it would be like this, but his gaze was fixed only on a single man. Jesus had stopped. Eleazar couldn't tell if Jesus had already noticed him before, or if it was his scream that made him stop. But what he knew was that, at that moment, Jesus' gaze was upon him, and that look, it wasn't contemptuous. There was no fear, no disgust, no aversion in Jesus' eyes. There was compassion. Eleazar felt a lump in his throat. He didn't expect that. He expected to be shooed away, to be insulted, to be humiliated once again. But there, in front of that man, he saw something he hadn't seen in a long time. Hope. The tears came before he could stop them. Eleazar fell to his knees, his body no longer strong, his soul no longer resisting. With a choked voice, he shouted for everyone to hear, "If you want, you can purify me." Their cry tore through the silence like thunder. And then fear gripped the crowd. People started to murmur among themselves. Some stood still, others took steps back. One of the disciples looked at Jesus, worried. Pedro whispered something to the others, but no one dared to interrupt what was about to happen. They knew what the law said. No one should touch a leper. And still, Jesus did not move. Eleazar breathed hard, his chest rising and falling rapidly. It was his last appeal, his last request, his last chance. He waited for rejection. But Jesus stepped forward, and what happened next would change everything forever. Now I ask you, what do you think Jesus will do? Do you believe that Eleazar can be cured? Write in the comments, "I believe in the power of Jesus." And let's continue this story together. The silence was absolute. The sound of the wind had ceased. The murmuring voices of the crowd had fallen silent, and everything seemed suspended in time. The air was heavy, charged with expectation. No one dared to move. Eleazar, still kneeling on the floor, was breathing heavily. His chest rose and fell rapidly. His dry throat burned after crying out for help. "If you want, you can purify me." The words still echoed in the air. His body was still, his eyes wide, fixed on the figure before him. Jesus had not moved away. The crowd watched the scene with terrified looks. A leper was there, so close, and Jesus hadn't backed away. The Pharisees, always attentive to the strict application of the law, were already whispering among themselves. This was unthinkable. Would a teacher, a respected rabbi, allow an impure man to approach? This violated every tradition, every rule, everything he had been taught. And then Jesus stepped forward. There was a collective movement in the crowd, as if people had instinctively backed away when they saw that he was actually approaching this filthy man, but he didn't hesitate. The disciples, on the other hand, were tense. Pedro clenched his fists. João exchanged a nervous look with Tiago. None of them understood what Jesus was about to do, but he knew. Eleazar didn't dare move. His heart was beating so hard he could feel the pulse in his ears. His body was so weak that he could barely support himself, and yet a strange feeling was growing inside him. He felt like something impossible was about to happen. Jesus then stopped right in front of him, and the unexpected happened. With the greatest calm in the world, Jesus stretched out his hand. The crowd held its breath. A Pharisee even let out a muffled scream. Some women covered their mouths, shocked. The air seemed to grow heavier. Was he going to touch a leper? It was prohibited. It was unclean. It was absurd. But for Jesus, there were no unclean ones. His fingers touched Eleazar's broken skin, and at that moment, the world has changed. The touch was soft, a simple gesture, without rush, without fear, without repulsion. Something Eleazar hadn't felt in years, the touch of another human being. Eleazar opened his eyes wide, unable to comprehend what was happening. His entire body shook. He felt the warmth of Jesus' hand against his skin. But there was more than that. There was life. It was as if an invisible fire began to course through his body, something he couldn't explain. The heat took over his limbs, his skin, his flesh, entering his bones, as if every cell in his body was being restored. Then the voice of Jesus broke the silence. "I want." Those words fell like thunder in Eleazar's heart. Jesus wanted to heal him. Not only could he, I wanted, be purified. And then it happened. A golden light began to envelop Eleazar. First subtly, like a soft glow, then stronger, more intense. The light seemed to come from within him, radiating through his body. The crowd watched breathlessly. The disciples looked on, mouths open. No one had ever witnessed anything like this, and before everyone's eyes, Eleazar was healed. The wounds began to close. The deep marks on his skin were gone, replaced by a healthy, fresh tone that he hadn't seen in years. The cracks on his lips were gone. The deformed fingers returned to normal. The face, previously consumed by illness, now shone like that of a reborn man. Eleazar felt the transformation happening. He put his hands over his own face, feeling the smooth skin. No wounds, no pain. He looked at his arms. Now strong, without the marks of leprosy, he was cured. A sob escaped his mouth. It was real. The crowd, who had previously watched in shock, exploded in reactions. Some fell to their knees, crying. Others shouted, exalting God. It was a miracle before his eyes. The Pharisees were pale. Their mouths opened, but no words came out. They had no explanation for that. No law, no ancient teaching could explain what they had just witnessed. Eleazar couldn't hold back his tears. He fell face down on the ground at Jesus' feet, unable to utter anything other than sobs and groans of gratitude. His heart was exploding. He could hardly believe it. After so many years of pain, loneliness, and despair, he was cured. Eleazar trembled. His hands, which were once covered in wounds, now slid gently over his skin. There was no more pain. There was no longer rotting flesh. There was no longer the smell of death permeating his body. He felt his skin smooth, restored, warm, and alive again. The air felt different. He took a deep breath for the first time in years without feeling the crushing weight of his illness. His chest expanded painlessly, his lungs filled with fresh air, and he felt a wave of energy running through his body, something he hadn't felt in a long time. He was whole. He ran his hands over his face, feeling the softness of his skin, something that seemed impossible not so long ago. Eleazar was restored. The miracle had not just been physical. He felt an inner strength that had long been quenched by pain and despair. His eyes widened as he took in that reality. Was he really cured? Was this possible? Eleazar looked at his arms, now without wounds, without cracks, without the dead flesh that once consumed his body. He moved his fingers, now strong and agile. He touched his own feet, those that were previously covered in open wounds and that now supported his weight firmly. And then he fell to his knees. The tears came before he could even stop them. They poured from his tired eyes, sliding down his face in a torrent of gratitude. He sobbed like a child, unable to contain his emotion. How many nights did he spend asking God to take away his pain? How many times have you cried out for an end to your suffering, believing that there was no longer a solution? But there he was, cured, restored, alive. The crowd remained paralyzed. Some people cried, others fell to their knees, unable to understand such wonder. The Pharisees exchanged disturbed looks, not knowing how to react. The disciples still seemed impacted by what they had just witnessed. No one had ever seen anything like this. And in the midst of that reverent silence, Jesus' voice echoed, "Get up, your faith has saved you." The words felt like a balm to Eleazar. He raised his face, bathed in tears, and saw Jesus looking at him. The Master's gaze was not just of compassion, but of joy. Jesus, he used to smile. It was a smile of tenderness, of love, of approval. It wasn't a smile of surprise, because he already knew the miracle would happen. It was a smile that said, "I have always been waiting for you." Eleazar felt a lump in his throat. How could he thank you? How could I express everything I felt? He wanted to speak. He wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come out. He wanted to say how grateful he was. I wanted to tell everything I had suffered. I wanted to shout to the world that Jesus was really the Messiah, the Son of God. But the words were too small for what was in his heart. So he did the only thing he could. He bowed to the ground and kissed Jesus' feet. And in that moment, Eleazar understood something much greater than his own physical healing. He hadn't just received a new body. He had been given a new life. Now I ask you, what would you do if you were in Eleazar's place? Do you believe that Jesus still performs miracles? Comment below. I believe in the power of Jesus. And let's continue this story together. The dust from the path still hung in the air. The crowd, which had previously moved away from Eleazar as if he were death incarnate, now remained motionless, in complete silence. No one could take their eyes off what had just happened. Eyes roamed the man's body, which minutes ago was a heap of diseased flesh and fragile bones. Now Eleazar was on his feet, completely restored. His skin, once full of open wounds and scars, was now clean. His feet, which had not supported their own weight without pain for years, were now firm. There was no more weakness, no more disease, no more leprosy. And then the buzz started. "But how is this possible?" a woman whispered, still holding her little son's hand. "I saw it with my own eyes. I knew this man," a merchant exclaimed, putting his hands on his head. "It was Eleazar, the leper, the same one who was always begging outside the city gates." Astonishment took over everyone. Some were crying, others simply didn't know how to react. How could something like this happen? How could a man who was already practically condemned to death now be there, in front of them, completely healed? The answer was obvious, but no one dared say it out loud. Jesus. He had done this, a miracle so evident, so extraordinary, that no argument could deny it. No Pharisee, no priest, no man on the face of the earth could refute what had happened, but even so, some tried. On the left side of the crowd, a group of men observed the scene with expressions full of indignation. The Pharisees. His narrow eyes analyzed Jesus with a mixture of anger and fear. They saw what happened. They knew it was a miracle. But if they acknowledged this publicly, they would have to admit that Jesus had a power that they did not have. And that was unacceptable. One of them, a man in long, imposing robes, crossed his arms and gave one of his companions a hard look. If Jesus continued performing signs like that, the people would begin to follow him. He would become a real threat to Israel's religious leadership. Another Pharisee approached and whispered, without taking his eyes off Jesus, "We cannot allow him to continue. If the people believe that he has this power, he will be called the Messiah." The word hung in the air like a storm about to brew. Messiah. The Pharisees did not even want to consider this possibility. If Jesus really were the Messiah, then their power would no longer make sense. The temple, the sacrifices, the rituals, everything would lose its importance if that man were, in fact, the Son of God. Meanwhile, the crowd began to murmur, "Who else could do something like this? No priest has ever cured a leper. Will he be the Messiah?" This question spread among the people like fire through dry straw. It was impossible not to think about it. The prophets had spoken of the coming of a Savior, an anointed one of God, who would bring healing and deliverance to the oppressed. And now, before his eyes, stood a man who he touched lepers and restored them completely. The long-robed Pharisee closed his hands into fists. He needed to stop that idea from spreading. I needed to do something. But what could you do against someone who performed miracles in front of a whole crowd? The sun was already beginning to set over the horizon when Eliezer left the crowd behind. The heat of the day still vibrated in the air, but his heart felt light, as if he had been touched by a cool, renewing breeze. His feet touched the firm ground with a lightness he had never imagined. Feeling again, he was cured. His body, once consumed by leprosy, was now strong. His steps were agile, his breathing flowed effortlessly. Each step brought him closer to home. But what if they didn't recognize him? What if they had moved on, accepted his death, forgotten who he was? Eleazar tried to shake off his fear. No, he needed to believe. In the distance, he saw the small village. Nothing had changed. The stone and mud houses were still in the same place. The olive trees swayed gently in. The wind and the smell of bread baking in the wood oven brought back memories of a life he believed he had lost forever. His heart sped up. He could just open the door and say, "I'm back." His eyes searched for a specific spot. Your home. It was a simple construction, but for Eleazar, it was the place where his life had begun. How many times had he walked through that door carrying fabrics to sell? How many times had he entered and been greeted by the warm hugs of his children? How many times had his wife Miriam waited anxiously for him, smiling? But now, did she still hope? Eleazar stopped in front of the house. Time seemed to have frozen. The smell of burning wood came from inside, and he could hear voices, children's laughter, familiar murmurs. His family was there. His fingers touched the rough wooden door. For a moment he hesitated. What would he say? How would you explain the impossible? He took a deep breath and knocked. Silence took over the interior of the house. Footsteps approached. The door creaked as it slowly opened, and then his eyes met hers. Miriam remained motionless. Time seemed to stop. His eyes widened, his mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. She stood before her husband, who had been presumed dead, in front of a man who should be rotting in a cave, but there was Eleazar, alive, healthy. Miriam brought her hand to her mouth, unable to contain her shock. Tears welled up in her eyes. Behind her, 2 children appeared. The youngest, Eleazar's youngest son, did not recognize him immediately, but the oldest, the boy swallowed. His face showed confusion and surprise. "Good?" The voice came out as a hesitant whisper. It was enough. Miriam burst into tears and threw herself into her husband's arms. Eleazar held her tightly, feeling the warmth of the hug he had dreamed of receiving again. The children ran to him, and soon they were all together, crying, laughing, touching him as if they needed to make sure he was real. But how? Miriam finally managed to ask, pulling away a little to look into his eyes. Eleazar took a deep breath. How to explain something so grand? Then he simply said, "Jesus touched me and healed me." The silence in the house was filled only by the sound of his family's shaky breaths. The name of Jesus echoed through the hearts of each of them. "Now tell me, If you were in Miriam's shoes, would you believe it? Do you believe that Jesus still performs miracles like this? Comment below. I believe in the power of Jesus. And let's continue this story together. The wind blew gently through the village's narrow streets. The smell of freshly baked bread still hung in the air, mixed with the woody aroma of wood burning in the ovens. The voices around them sounded quieter, as if everyone was still trying to understand what had happened. Eleazar was standing strong, healthy, surrounded by his wife and children, who hugged him as if they were afraid he would disappear again. But within Eleazar, something much bigger had changed. Yes, his body was restored. There were no more wounds, no more pain, but the true transformation that had taken place in him went beyond the flesh. His heart had been healed. For years, Eleazar lived as an undead, not just because of the disease that consumed his body, but because his soul had been destroyed by rejection, by abandonment, by loneliness. He carried within himself the weight of shame, of humiliation, of the certainty that he would never be loved again, never again be seen as a man worthy of being among the living. Leprosy had not just killed his body, it had killed his hope. But when Jesus touched him, when the impossible happened before everyone's eyes, something inside him was restored that no disease could take away. Eleazar looked at his now clean hands and took a deep breath. Yes, he had been healed. But what Jesus had actually done was something much greater. He had given her back her faith. What happened to Eleazar? It wasn't just about his body being restored. It was about his soul being brought back to life. It was then that Eleazar heard Jesus' voice again. He was no longer in the crowd, but Eleazar could feel his words echoing within him, as if each syllable was engraved in his heart. It's not just the flesh that needs healing, but the heart. And in that instant, Eleazar understood. He had spent years waiting for his body to be restored, but the truth was that his soul was even sicker than his flesh. How many years did he spend carrying the weight of resentment? How many times did he curse those who rejected him? How many nights did he spend crying in anger, wishing God would punish them for abandoning him? But Jesus didn't just heal his body. Jesus taught him to forgive. Your greatest miracle, it wasn't leaving your skin clean. It was freeing him from the pain of the past. It was there, surrounded by his family, feeling the warm touch of his wife's hand on his face, hearing his children's laughter, that Eleazar realized he was a new man, and now he needed to share this truth with everyone. Eleazar turned to the people around him. They still looked at him in amazement, trying to understand how that was possible. He knew some were still stuck in doubt. Others, like the Pharisees, they refused to believe, even when they saw the proof before their eyes. Then Eleazar took a deep breath, and with a firm voice full of emotion declared, "For years, I was the walking dead, not just because leprosy consumed my body, but because my soul was torn apart. I believed that God had abandoned me. I believed my life was over." He paused and looked up at the sky, the same sky that so many times he cursed in his lonely nights. Now he saw that sky differently. But Jesus touched me, and not just my body was restored, my heart was transformed. The silence that took over the village was almost palpable. Everyone was absorbing those words. Some had tears in their eyes. Others seemed to reflect deeply. And then Eleazar looked straight into the eyes of every person around. How many times do we feel rejected, hopeless? How many times do we believe that we are alone, that there is no solution for us anymore? But faith can lead us to transformation. The words were like arrows reaching every heart present there, because deep down, everyone carried invisible wounds. Not all were lepers, but everyone at some point had felt the weight of pain, rejection, hopelessness. And that's what Jesus did. He healed beyond what the eyes could see. Eleazar took a deep breath and looked around. The entire village was standing before him, listening to every word that came out of his mouth. He could still feel the touch of Jesus on his skin, the healing warmth that had restored him, not just on the outside, but on the inside as well. Eleazar was no longer the same. That man consumed by pain and abandonment no longer existed. In its place, there was a restored man, full of faith, ready to live a new life. He looked at his hands, once gnarled and covered in wounds. Now they were clean. He looked at his feet, which before couldn't support his own weight. Now they were firm. He looked at his family, who had previously lost him to leprosy. Now they were together again. And then came the question, a voice in the crowd, hesitant, full of doubt and hope at the same time. How was this possible? Eleazar smiled. He knew the answer. Jesus. The name rang like an absolute truth, echoing in the silence of the crowd. Jesus touched me, and I was healed. Some of those present looked at each other, trying to understand. Others let silent tears escape. Some seemed uneasy, as if they were faced with something too big for their minds to comprehend. But Eleazar knew that it wasn't just his body that had been restored. Something much bigger had happened. He took a step forward and looked directly at those watching him with wide eyes. If I found healing and redemption, what stops you from believing in the impossible? The impact of those words was undeniable. Many there carried their own wounds. Not visible wounds, like his, but deep wounds in the soul. How many there had already lost hope? How many have felt rejected, abandoned, condemned by their mistakes or their circumstances? How many lived believing that there was no way out, that God had forgotten them? Eleazar knew this feeling well, because he had already been there. I spent years believing my story was over. I spent years listening to people tell me that I was no longer valuable, that I was a burden, a mistake, a man doomed to rot alone. He paused and looked into the eyes of everyone there. But God was not finished with my story. And then, as if those words had touched something deep within everyone, a buzz began to emerge among the crowd. What if Jesus can heal me too? Is there hope for me? If he can do that to a leper, what else can he do? Eleazar smiled. He knew those questions, because he had already done them all. He looked up at the sky, and his heart was filled with gratitude. The journey he had been on, the pain, the rejection, the loneliness, it had all led him to this moment. And now he knew his mission wasn't just to live his new life, it was witnessing what Jesus had done. He turned to the crowd once more and said, "It's not too late for you." Some sobbed softly. Others just closed their eyes, taking in every word. The truth was clear. If Jesus did this for Eleazar, he can do it for anyone. Now I ask you, what stops you from believing? If this story touched you, share and leave your comment. And don't stop here. There are many other miracles of Jesus that need to be known. In the next video, we will reveal another one of our Lord's incredible miracles. So if you believe in the power of God, comment below. I believe in the impossible, and let's continue this journey of faith together. Only here on the Hidden Stories of Jesus.